because the setting is fantasy, but it's also has like, you have guns and you have like a mix of sci-fi fantasy. Oh, it's a sci-fi fantasy. Hello, I'm the Jagged Wizard, and today I'm going to be talking about ICON. My experience with it is not a final experience with the game.
Hello, this is the Editing Wizard here. So I noticed today when I was preparing to publish this video that, in fact today, on June 8th, 2023, a massive update was released. That's just an important note for you to know that there have been some changes. A lot of the narrative play is very similar, so that won't affect most of this video, but I figured I'd throw that out there. There's a lot of new stuff, especially in combat, so I'll have to rework some of what I'm doing for next week.
ICON takes place in a world that is post-apocalyptic. And so what that means is the world ended, and then people are mostly recovered from the fact that the world ended, and that's where the stories take place. I really enjoyed this system. There are things about it that I'm not sure if I entirely like, but it is enjoyable. And I am going to be splitting this up into two videos because there are two parts of this game. The first part is narrative play, which is all of your social and exploration and maybe a little bit of combat if it's not super intense. And then you have the tactical play, which is very traditional war game style. The rulebook compares it to the Final Fantasy games. I haven't played any of them, so I wouldn't know. The tactical combat was very specific and very fascinating to play, although I'm not entirely sure it's my favorite combat system out there. Today, I'm going to be talking about the narrative play. So narrative play is completely separate from tactical combat. That's an important thing to understand about ICON and when you're playing it, is that these two worlds don't interact. None of your abilities from narrative play can affect combat. None of your combat abilities can affect narrative play. So when creating a character, you pick a kin, which is essentially a cosmetic choice of how your character looks. It has no mechanical bearings on your character, and so that's the first thing you choose. Next, you're going to be choosing a culture. And this is where you'll get some sort of bonus associated with your culture and the skills you developed while growing up. Most of your narrative choices and your character build is going to come from your bond, which is similar to a class, except it gives you a motivation for your character. You have, I think, about 12 different bonds that you can choose for your character. These bonds determine how much your character is able to endure before they need to take a rest. And then they will also give you options of different powers that you will get to be able to aid yourself or your party. With your bond, you get to choose skills that you want to be competent in. And again, these are only applicable in narrative play. And these skills there are only 10 skills in the game. They're pretty minimal, but they do encompass a broad thing. And the important thing about narrative play and in playing it is that it is a dice pooling system. So essentially, you can have up to 4 ranks in a skill. And for every one of those, you roll a d6. And if you roll a 6, that's a success. And so essentially, you're trying to get more dice, so you're more likely to roll a 6 whenever you use any skill. And for me, I really liked how the narrative play worked. It was really cool to be able to kind of flow between different skills and have different characters that can do different things. Another thing about narrative play is that your character has so much strain that you can take, like you can do only so many like dangerous things before your character starts to like feel it. And I really like how they've implemented that, because your character, once they take a certain level of, it's called strain, from like failed activities, you take a burden, which is essentially some sort of disability or penalty to rolls or to your skills until you've camped for a night. And I really like how eventually you can build up more of these, and the more you get, the more your character is just worn down by the effects of adventuring. It can get to the point, probably in a longer campaign, this would never happen in a one-shot unless your GM is literally trying to kill your characters with only narrative methods. Your characters could eventually get to the point where they really have to take months off of adventuring before they're able to even consider going back Something I really want to point out about this system that I noticed, so there are 3 degrees of difficulty for any given skill. So there are 3 degrees of difficulty. You have controlled, where you are far less likely to have any lingering consequences. You have risky, which is kind of your standard, what you expect skills to be, where there is a decent amount of risk, but it's not like you're gonna, cause serious repercussions. And then there's desperate. If you're doing a desperate action, you should fully expect that if you do not succeed, there are going to be some very serious consequences. And I really like how this system has those different degrees of success. And the GM tells you that before you make the roll, before you decide to go through an action, because your character would know how risky these actions are. And with that, you also have different degrees of efficacy. So if you're using a skill like, say you're trying to use study to try and disable a bomb rather than tinker, which is the more appropriate skill and more direct skill, you'd have a lower efficacy while retaining probably the same level of risk. That is one thing that I really like about it, is that before taking any action how dangerous it is for your character. Because if you're doing something very risky, your character will know that and will decide whether or not that's something they want to do. And for me, that's something that really stands out about this narrative system, and something I really enjoyed. In addition to the level of risk, you also have a level of effect. And so there are 3 levels of effect, 4 levels of effect. You have no effect, where essentially the GM can tell you that it doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to succeed at this roll. You have low or weak effect. You have powerful effect, and then you have super powered effects, which are essentially doubled up crits from what I gathered. And so that's another thing I really liked about this game, is that you have different degrees of how effective different actions are going to be. Trying to use Tinker to get around quietly is probably going to be less effective than just having sneak abilities. This narrative system, I really like how you have so many degrees of danger for different actions, and it's not necessarily just a pass-fail, which is something that if you roll less than a 6 but still roll high, it may not necessarily be an outright failure, but it probably won't come out with your desired results. And so there's so many cool things about this. Another thing I want to touch on here is the artwork. The artwork in this rulebook is amazing. I'm going to put some up. I really like the artwork. I really like the concepts for these characters. Another very important thing about narrative play is that your characters are designed to be what the game calls icons. You aren't supposed to be some menial person who's just struggling to get by. You are supposed to be this kind of outlandish, powerful character. And that's something that the game really leans into with their skills and with how the game works, that I really, really like. It's not shying away from the fact that, yes, you are an exceptional person if you're out adventuring. And I think it's really cool how the game's advice to the GM and to the players emphasizes that, because it's cool to be able to play in a world where you are exceptional, because none of us really get to live in a world where we have these, we have these magics, or we have these exceptional, sneaking skills where you can sneak through an entire castle without being noticed. So something about the narrative system is that, and I think it applies to all of the game, but it's specifically mentioned in the narrative section, is that the game doesn't care how your abilities work. And that's something I really like, is I was playing this character who was essentially living at the doors of death. They had lived longer than they ever should have been able to, and were just kind of barely alive, and not strong, not really good at these things. But I like this idea that my skills don't necessarily have to be physical skills, but it can be anything I want. It could be like a contraption I've made and it does it for me, or it could be something where I use magic, or I could just be someone who's exceptionally skilled. And I like the freedom that this allows your character to be your character and have the flavor you want in this setting. Because the setting is fantasy, but it's also has you have guns and you have like a mix of sci-fi fantasy. No, it's a sci-fi fantasy. And I really like that about this system. It's very, very cool to see the versatility in this. And so I essentially played someone who worked with a deck of cards and used them to like draw fates. And so I use that for both my narrative and combat play. As this is how my character works. I have this deck of cards and I can use these cards to create lightning bolts or something spectacular or not so spectacular if you're my party that was with me, because they were all sneaking and I caused a lightning bolt. They weren't very happy with me, and I really like the openness of that. Again, this is something I really like about this narrative play, is that it is open to whatever you want it to be. It's really up to the GM to determine what your characters are capable of and how dangerous these things are. And so your GM can make your characters either much more powerful or much less powerful. Overall, especially because this is a playtest, I think it's really cool and I think it's well worth giving them feedback. I'm going to be back next week with a video about tactical gameplay in ICON, and I am super excited to talk about that and wrap up my final thoughts about the game in that video. If you've enjoyed this video, please like it and please subscribe if you're interested in hearing more about ICON. And if you want me to do maybe more tutorial type videos about ICON, maybe building a character or something, let me know in the comments below. I would be happy to do that. And thank you so much for watching this far into the video, and have a great day.